People often ask whether it's nature or nurture that creates a serial killer. Well, it's actually both and more. I like to say that genetics loads the gun, personality and psychology aim it, and your experiences pull the trigger. Your genetics give you the potentiality to be a killer, but your personality and psychology are the filter through which you experience, and they can shade how you come away from any event in your life. I'm Jim Clementi. I'm a retired FBI supervisory special agent and profiler in the Behavioral Analysis Unit. As a profiler, my job was to hunt down child abductors, serial rapists, and serial killers. We help out where forensics fail. If we look at how the crime was committed, that leads us to why the crime was committed, and that leads us to who committed the crime. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is part of the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. And as such, we study all violent and sexual crimes across this country and much of it around the world, so that we can then train law enforcement so that they can get the benefit of our research in our training. The original FBI profilers, Dick Ault, John Douglas, Roy Hazelwood, Robert Ressler, Pete Smerick, they gained this body of knowledge by actually going into prisons and interviewing convicted serial killers. They interviewed them in great detail about what they did and also how they grew up and how they felt during the entire time that they were killing people, developing this criminal expertise, and that they were getting away with these crimes. For example, from Ed Kemper, they learned that he had a very difficult relationship with his mother. So he started killing surrogates in place of her, and then he killed his mother. David Berkowitz showed how sexual frustration can be taken out on innocent people on the streets of New York. From Ted Bundy, they learned that he was a sexual sadist, that he got off on causing and witnessing the pain and suffering of others. But he did that many times by using his psychopathic charm to lure in victims, and he feigned injury so that it was the people who wanted to help him that he ended up killing. So now we have an amazing volume of institutional knowledge about these offenders, and it tells us how they killed and why they killed, and it helps us to hunt them down. Criminal profiling is basically reverse engineering a crime. We look at the victimology, the choice of the victims. We look at the crime scene. We look at the organization level, and then pre- and post-offense behavior. And together, all those things tell us the kind of person who committed the crime. Victimology is the study of the victim, their life, their desires, their education, their daily routine. Because an offender picks a particular victim at a particular place, at a particular time, in a particular manner, for a particular purpose. And all those choices leak out information about the offender, about their skills and abilities, about their desires, and they can lead us right back to the offender. The crime location can tell us a lot. Did the crime occur on a farm in the middle of Iowa, where the only potential witnesses are a bunch of cows and pigs? Or did it happen in New York City's Times Square, where at any given moment there may be 50 to 100,000 potential eyewitnesses? Pulling off a crime in either of those locations tells you a lot about the offender. At the crime scene, we look at the offender's behavior. How much time did they spend there? What was their interaction with the victims? And what was their criminal sophistication level? The choice of weapons that an offender uses at a crime scene reveals a tremendous amount of information about them. Did the offender use a gun and kill somebody from a distance? Or did they get up close and personal and use a knife? That's a different kind of person who typically is engaged in different kinds of profession than somebody who will not get up close and personal. Next, we look at the offender's organization level. The two types of offenders that we see are on a spectrum between organized and disorganized. The organized offender will plan it in advance, fantasize about committing the crime, and then bring all the implements necessary to commit the crime and then take them away with him after the crime. Whereas the disorganized offender is impulsive. They don't plan the crimes out in advance. They may have lowered inhibitions because of drug or alcohol use, and they basically pick up the implements along the way and may leave them behind, leaving a lot of forensic evidence for law enforcement to find. If an offender doesn't have a very high skill level in terms of getting access to victims, they'll pick victims who lead very high-risk lives, prostitutes and drug addicts, whereas a very sophisticated offender will be able to acquire victims in the privacy and security of their own homes. It takes a much different level of criminal sophistication to be able to accomplish those two different crimes. The next level of criminal behavioral analysis is looking at pre- and post-offense behavior. If they're organized offenders, they probably did pre-offense surveillance to check out the location, maybe even surveil potential victims and stalk them. Also, we find that offenders, after they commit a serious criminal offense, will have behavioral changes that people around them might see. For example, if an offender has committed an abduction and murder, they would likely leave the area, making up an excuse, an emergency to get out of town. And they wouldn't return until everything calmed down and they felt it was safe to come back. Building a profile is simply taking all of those 5 factors and looking at what information the offender leaks out by behaving in those particular ways. When I analyze a crime scene, I look at various types of evidence, some of which we have here. Pictures inside the house where the crime occurred, crime scene photographs, autopsy pictures, as well as an affidavit summarizing the facts of the case and the crime scene description. Typically, I'd like to ask a lot more questions and get much more data, but I think we have enough, at least now, to start a preliminary profile. So I'm looking at a case of a double homicide of a male and female. The male appears to be in his early 20s. He was shot about 5 times. He has an unknown relationship to the female victim, who appears to have been pregnant, and she was shot 7 to 8 times in her face and head and upper torso. It also appears that the male may have scrawled in grease several letters. He's found on the floor of the back room by the back door. She's found in a room next to it, half hanging off the bed with her head on a couch that's pushed up right next to the bed. It appears that she was first shot while she was laying on her back on the bed, and that she either rolled over to try to get away or was flipped over by someone and shot again, where she died in place. My first impressions are that the male victim was killed first, that he was a practical kill to get him out of the way, whereas the female victim was shot multiple times in the chest and at least once in the face and another time in the head. She appears to be the main target of this attack. So if we start with victimology, we know that the first victim, the male, grew up in this town and had left town for several years and came back. He's got no known criminal history yet. In this house, $11,000 in cash was found, 3.5 pounds of marijuana was found, and powdery substance that appeared to be drugs was also found. That tells me that they were engaged in a high-risk activity, drug trafficking. But the fact that the drugs and the money were left behind tells me there's a high probability that this was not a drug-related hit. I believe that if drug dealers were involved in this, they would have taken the drugs and they would have taken the cash. This tells me there's a level of immaturity in this offender. Somebody who didn't have the presence of mind to search for these things or didn't even think that they might be there. I would put the intelligence level of the offender at mid to low because they made a flimsy attempt at cleaning up after themselves. And that could also mean that their inhibitions were diminished by drugs or alcohol. Something that's particularly unusual in this crime scene is the letters that are scrawled on the floor, apparently by the male victim, with grease that was squirted onto the floor. They attempt, it appears, to spell out a name, JFF, and then under that BOPE, sort of a last dying declaration. This could indicate either a person or some kind of motive. As a criminal behavioral analyst, I want to determine whether this is an actual message that was left by the dying male or whether this is staging in order to misdirect investigators. So I'd like to know if he had grease on one or more of his hands or fingers, and whether or not he was left-handed or right-handed, and whether or not that was the hand that had the grease on it. The organization level of this crime is fairly low. Even though the offender brought the gun he used to commit the murders with him, he left forensic evidence behind. And that tells me he doesn't have a very high level of forensic or criminal sophistication. When we look at pre- and post-offense behavior, since it doesn't look like he's very criminally sophisticated, this could be one of the only times he committed a crime like this. And I believe that he may have gone into a panic afterwards. I would think that somewhere between where he committed these crimes and where he went, you would find the weapon in a dumpster, a body of water, or a place he thought it would be hidden. I would also expect somebody like that to make an excuse to either leave the area or leave town for a period of time until everything calms down. So in this case, I believe that how the victims were killed tells us a story. I believe he was a practical kill and she was the target of this double homicide. Also, the fact that she was pregnant may indicate that the why was jealousy and that there was another person, sort of a love triangle here, and that the person responsible was the third person in this love triangle or a family member. In the DC sniper case, the entire Washington, D.C. area was terrorized for 23 days. A number of random people were shot and killed or injured. It turns out this was a longer spree that had started in the state of Washington and spanned the entire country. So I became involved in the case because I was working in the behavioral analysis unit at the time, and we consulted on the investigation. Immediately, this case presented as if it were a spree killer. 6 murders in the space of 27 hours. So we didn't think he was targeting a particular type of group. The victimology was completely random. Typically in spree cases, the offender is on the run and commits murder after murder after murder, but decompensates over that time. The rush of adrenaline and the excitement and the fear of getting away, all those things can cause an offender to make more mistakes as time goes on. But in this case, that wasn't happening. The shootings themselves indicated that there was pre-attack surveillance. This offender planned and executed 6 murders within the space of 27 hours and was a ghost. No one even saw him. That told us right away that he had a certain level of calm, cool, and collectedness, that he was probably in his mid to late 40s and had police or military training. But more than that, he must have actually had experience on the streets as a police officer or on the battlefield. Because pulling the trigger on a paper target is one thing, but taking the life of an unknown individual is a whole nother matter. So when we started the profile, we based it only on statistics. And statistically, snipers are in their 40s or 50s, white males, and they have a grudge against society or somebody in particular that they take out on their victims. Another thing about snipers is that they have a God complex. They want to take life from afar and above so they can feel omnipotent like God. And because of that, it's very important to appease them and not challenge them. Unfortunately, that's not what law enforcement was doing at the time. They called them a coward, and they said the streets are safe and the schools are safe. So the sniper shot a kid walking into school the next day. But they left a tarot card, the death card. And on that card, there was indications of duality. First of all, it said, "Call me God," which reinforced our opinion that the sniper had a God complex. And it went on to say, "This is for you, Mr. Police." And that looks as though the writer is looking up to the police, calling them Mr. Police. It also has its origins in a number of reggae songs, so that could mean that the offender had a Caribbean influence. But then it said, "Do not release to the press." And press is an older word, something that older people use, which is consistent with the level of sophistication of planning and executing these crimes, but not consistent with looking up to the police. So for the first time, we had to consider whether this offender was calm, cool, and collected when he plans and executes his murders, but he decompensates when he's writing. Or, for the first time in U.S. history, we have a sniper team. One older in his mid-40s and one younger in his teens. But the fact is that we know that because snipers have a God complex, they don't work well together. So I theorized that the older one was actually controlling the younger one. And I went as far as saying that he may be controlling him through sexual victimization, because that would give him complete control over the younger person. In fact, 10 years after they were caught and convicted, Malvo disclosed that Muhammad had been sexually victimizing him the whole time. So in the end, our profile was that of two snipers working together, both African American, one in his mid-40s, having police or military training and experience, one in his teens. Once we released that profile, and because of other work that the FBI was doing parallel that reinforced our profile, Muhammad and Malvo were arrested within 24 hours. Developing the profile in the DC sniper case was groundbreaking because in the vast majority of previous sniper cases in the United States of America, they were committed by lone offenders who were white, male, who were in their 40s or 50s with a particular grudge. And this case blew that profile to pieces. As criminal behavioral analysts, we look at how the offender committed the crime and determine why they committed the crime, and that leads us to who committed the crime. In many of these cases, local law enforcement has absolutely no idea who committed the crime and no leads, but criminal behavioral analysis can generate leads as to the type of person who committed the crime. And in many cases across the country, criminal behavioral analysis has led to the identification, arrest, and conviction of the offenders.